Welcome to the Friends of the Earth System Change webinar series. This aims to facilitate learners to connect the dots between global justice issues, to draw out the root causes of injustice and reflect upon action pathways, while also amplifying the work being done by groups locally and around the world. Today we're focusing on climate justice and local climate action with Yvonne O'Callaghan from the Services Industrial Professional and Technical Union, also known as SIPTU, which represents over 180,000 workers across almost every sector in Ireland. SIPTU assists workers when dealing with employers, government and other institutions. Yvonne is also a climate action organiser working with groups such as Fridays for Future. And SIPTU is a founding member of the Just Transition Alliance, working to ensure that no worker or community is left behind in the transition to a climate-friendly society. So I'll now pass over to Yvonne for a presentation taking a look at climate, economic and social justice. Thanks very much for joining us, Yvonne.
Great, thank you very much, Evan, and welcome everybody this evening to this fantastic event in kicking off the actions that Friends of the Earth are taking in relation to system change. As Evan pointed out, my name is Yvonne O'Callaghan. I work for the SIPTU Trade Union, and I also do our focus around climate action and climate change. The key campaigners in the trade union movement around climate action, and also part of the founding organisations in terms of the Just Transition Alliance, which I'll touch on a little bit later on in the presentation. But just to start us off, I'm going to talk a little bit around what I've deemed climate, economic and social justice, a common path for action. And I suppose one of the things that people always feel when trade unionists are talking about climate is that, are we really taking this issue into consideration in our work? And my answer to that is yes. Because without us talking about climate, we cannot talk about other forms of justice as well. They're interlinked, they're interdependent, and we need to bring them all together in order for that common path for action. So I focus on a little bit around that climate change is a social justice issue. And the reason why I'm focusing on that is because one of the pillars of the trade union movement that you hear us always talking about is the fight for social justice. And the reason for that is that social justice is one of those pillars that we campaign in the workplace, in our communities, at the national level and at the global level. And it's really about equal distribution of wealth, opportunities and privileges in our society. And that can be said about every facet of our economy, every facet of our society, and every facet of our communities and our workplaces. So that's important, is to make that linkage in the first place between climate change and climate justice and social justice. And it will make a real difference. And as I point out here in this slide, that there is that overlap between social impacts and the environmental science of climate change. And there is that word that we use quite often is intersectionality between climate and social justice. And it's important that we look at the climate crisis with those multiple lenses. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. But throughout the presentation, you see me refer back to this issue of equality and distribution, which is really important for the fight for climate justice. So coming back to really where we're at on climate is to the last IPCC report, is we're in a race against time. I pointed out to somebody yesterday, you know, we are not, if we're not at the races, if we're not Mo Farah sprinting down the track really fast, we're never going to really tackle climate change. So we really need to be looking at the accelerate action around climate change in order to change it into climate justice. And over the last 3 years, and you will have heard Mary Robinson say it in the last number of months, we have three big challenges. That's COVID, climate, and now conflict at the moment. But for workers in particular, and for trade unions, the COVID really disrupted lives, livelihoods, and indeed the future of work itself. And we are in that race where we need to make sure that all regions are protected, and that all workplaces are protected, and that everyone's protected. So you will have heard always leaving no one behind. And that's where we really need to focusing on, is that equality and inclusion are very important. And one of those elements, and I'll talk a little bit later on about, is we need to climate and employment proof our workplaces. So this is where we bring in the issue of a just transition, the need for job and to create a secure pathway to the future. And again, climate change cannot be ignored. That's something that we have to continuously remind ourselves, remind union members, remind employers that we cannot ignore the science, we cannot ignore that this is actually happening. So one of the main phrases of the trade union movement, you'll hear it time and time again, and here I have a picture of Sharon Burrow, who's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. And just to explain, at the global level, we have the ITUC, which is the International Trade Union Confederation, of which the Irish Congress of Trade Unions is a member, and every confederation in every country is a member of. So the International Trade Union Confederation leads the union movement's fight for climate justice. And our famous phrase that we often hear trade unionists say is that there are no jobs for workers on a dead planet. So this is very important that we have this to union members, and when we're talking about climate, that they are interlinked and we need to fight for both at the same time. So, of course, a little bit of science. I don't think I need to go through a lot of this for the participants this evening, but I think the type of statistics and the type of language that we are using with union members to talk to them about the climate emergency, it's about really putting forward some of those factual elements and looking at the injustices as part of that climate emergency. So you will see here, for example, on refugees and displaced people, outlined to them that is not simply about people fleeing war and persecution, it is now also about climate refugees. One of the elements of that is also public health and investment in public services, and how the changing in our climate will affect and public health systems. And then also looking at, and you see there, the ITUC, the International Trade Union Federation, did a global poll where it put out very clearly that 79% of people think employees should have the right to know what measures their company are planning to climate-proof their jobs and workplaces. So really what that's showing is this is becoming a top priority for trade union members. And I'll give the example of SIPTU's recent trade union national conference, and that we held 3 weeks ago. We not only had one, we had 4 motions on climate change to our conference. We ended up having one consolidated motion, which I could tell you was about 3 pages long. But this is seen now as a priority for union members, for workers, that they need to be talking about climate in the workplace and not just, we say, at the dinner table or at the coffee shop or when they're reading the news. But that's really important for us as trade unionists to really start linking the economic social justice and the climate justice elements for unions and our work. So in doing that, one of the things we need to begin to talk about and continue to talk about in our everyday work, whether it be collective agreement or talking simply to union members about health and safety issues or talking to them simply about pay rises, we need to look at how do we climate and employment proof our work. And this is also part of how do we engage with governments around the ambition that they have in terms of plans, particularly in relation to just transition. And every employer must for climate and employment proofing and just transition measures at the heart of what they are doing. Quite often, we do not have employments or employers wanting to talk about climate. They will see it as something that's not a priority, but it's our job as trade unionists and as unions and workers, priority for employers to consider climate action as part of what they are doing as part of the workplace. So it's really important that we have to coordinate those efforts to maintain and grow good jobs in a healthy, sustainable and more balanced economic future. And that's what a just transition looks like. So the time to act is now. I can't say it enough when I'm making such presentations, is that we need to act now. And that's why we are campaigning to urgently have a conversation about both climate and employment. And our economies are undergoing like those huge changes, and that's why we need workers being part of those teams designing the future with just transition plans. And the time, of course, is to act, and we cannot delay or postpone anything. So we need to work very hard to do that. People often say, "Why am I asking union members and trade unions to?" It's not just for them to wake up; it's for employers to wake up, and it's also about other elements of our society understanding that unions and their members have a very big role to play in how do we design the future in terms of achieving climate justice and real climate action by our government and other governments. So I suppose, what does transition mean for workers? I suppose one of the things I would say from the outset on a just transition, you will hear it used in many ways, in many guises, and in many situations by government, by policy makers. We say at this point as unions that the just transition, those two words seem to be abused by all and sundry, to describe what we should do in moving to zero carbon future. But for us as trade union movement, it's a very particular phrase because it comes from the EU movement, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for us, simply, it's about how do we transform our economies to that zero economy without leaving anybody behind, by ensuring that we don't increase inequalities, that we don't increase poverty, and that this is not about the wealthy achieving what they want, but that we have wealth redistribution in both the work community, and that we protect our public services. And in essence, what we are making is a new industrial transformation in our workplaces, but it must mean that it is equal, it is fair, while leaving no one behind. And we always refer back to the issue in the 1980s, and what happened in terms of mining communities in England. And that's an example of a bad just transition of its time. So we know what happens when we don't have a just transition, but we do know that we can craft a just transition for our own workers, members, and societies. What I was just referring to there, and you see the third box there, is the real definition of what a just transition is. And you quite hear often the Irish government talk about there is no definition for just transition. We would beg to differ. There is here and talking about better and decent jobs, social protection, more training opportunities, security for all, in relation to how do we transform our economies for workers. So it's really important for us that people understand what do we mean by that just transition and what that definition is. It's a definition that's been adopted by the International Labour Organization, and it's also adopted within the context of the various COP conferences in terms of the just transition. So we really have to refer back to that at all times when we talk about transition. And I think that's very important when we're doing that. It's not about job losses. It's not about lowering living standards. It's not about resulting in poor planning and misplaced faith and efficiency of the free market. That's very important for us to outline that, because if we are to bring workers along on this track of climate justice, we need to make sure that they are not at a loss, that we're not lowering living standards, as I said previously, increasing inequalities. So one of the elements, as I said there, was about decent jobs, and I always refer to, again, the leaving no one behind. But as you know, the discussions around Green New Deals in various countries, but I think it was really important when the Green New Deal was being discussed in the United States that there was some very key points made by those who were trying to bring this about. And you will see there, it's about strengthening and protecting the rights of workers to organise and collectively bargain, acting and enforcing trade rules, procurement standards, and board adjustments for strong labour protections. So for us, that's what a new deal around climate justice and a Green New Deal would be about ensuring and strengthening and protecting workers. But I think that's very important to really emphasize that when we talk about just transition, so that we leave no one behind. Now, you'll probably wonder why I want to talk about the future of work, talking about climate. But this is about, I think, over the last 2 years of the pandemic, what we have seen is we have now been face to face now with the future of work. And whether it be remote working, whether it be enhanced sick pay, whether it be all of those elements. And then part of just transition, we talk about those elements that are needed as part of the future of work. And it's always referred to in the definition of a just transition around social protection, around upskilling and equality issues. But I want to really focusing in there on the first point, for example, a universal labour guarantee that protects fundamental rights, adequate living wage, and health and safety. These are all the elements that have arisen over the last 2 years of a pandemic. The adequate living wage, we could refer to the PUP payment that was put in place as part of the response to the pandemic. Health and safety in the workplace. We know that the effect of climate on people working outside, for example, in construction. These are all those elements that we need to address. So when we address just transition, we're also addressing those elements that we need in the future of work. Social protection, a large element of that. But also, you'd also see greater investment in the care economy. And I think that's very important. And there also, in terms of gender equality as well. And so this is one of the other pillars that we look at when we talk about climate with workers, is incorporating that in terms of the future of work. What I will say is that there's some discussions around connecting the just transition with the digital economy. And in my point of view, I think that's a wrong thing to do. I think technological change can be a tool for climate action, but it doesn't mean that we are that is part of the just transition in terms of protecting workers and so forth. But I think what's very important is that we look at it from perspective of we are changing our industrial transformation in the workplace, but at the same time, we are also looking at the future of work, and therein after we're putting in those measures to protect not only workers, but their communities as well. So I suppose from a trade union perspective, many people will know that we form one of the big pillars at climate conferences at the international level and also at a European level when we're talking about climate. And we have been at the forefront of constructing and crafting and lobbying the various declarations that have come from the various UN conferences in terms of COP, and particularly in relation to the Schleswig Declaration, but also the outcome from COP20 in Glasgow around the element of a just transition. So when you see the language of a just transition coming from UN conferences, it's the trade union movement is leading on that. But I will say, over the last number of COP conferences, we have now made a very strong connection and I suppose and working together with both the environmental movement, which we've done for a long time, school climate strikers, and other elements of those fighting for climate justice. And I think that's very important, that convergence of all the different elements and different parts of social movements are coming together to fight not only for climate justice, but for economic and social justice. And I think that's really important, that from an international level, we can see that also at a local level when we talk about the just transition recently launched between the environmental movement, the trade union movement, and also those working in think tanks looking at this from other perspectives, particularly in terms of social justice. So that's really important, to look at how the work that we do at the international level and fighting for these issues, collaborating with others, fighting for climate justice, does not only happen there, it also happens here at a local level. And if you're looking for more information, and Evan would share the presentation, on what the international movement is doing on a just transition. We have at the international level a Just Transition Centre that brings together all the work that we do on climate justice in relation to just transition, but also in relation to how do we transform the different sectors of our economy through what we call the Global Union Federations, which is, it's basically, for example, we have Public Service International, which takes all the public sector unions of how they're transforming the public sector in terms of climate justice, and also then in terms of in the Industrial Law and Global Union Federation, which tackles manufacturing and global supply chains. So all those elements are really pulled together within the Just Transition Centre. So it's a really good source for going to for all action around what the union movement is doing around a just transition. Often people ask us what's happening elsewhere in terms of the just transition in various countries. So I just want to probably talk a little bit about some of the connections we have established with other just transition, I would call them commissions and actions by trade union movement elsewhere. So as many would know, in the Climate Action Plan in Ireland, there is a Just Transition Commission envisaged for Ireland to sit down and organise around what we call social dialogue. And when I talk about social dialogue, I'm talking about workers, employers and government talking together about how do we transform different parts of our economy, and in particular at the forefront of that, the energy sector in each country is the first sector people will look at in terms of the transition. In Ireland, we don't have at present a commission, and it's envisaged in the climate plan, but will not be operational from our understanding at this point until 2023. And I'll talk a little bit later on of what the Just Transition Alliance is doing to accelerate the establishment of a commission. But what we have at the moment is in various countries, so for example, in Canada, where the trade union movement has participated in a Just Transition Commission, they have already released a report around the work that they have done in talking with communities across Canada who are at the forefront of the transition to zero carbon economy. And that has been very fruitful in the sense that it has talked to those who may have been skeptical about climate change and climate justice, and have brought those communities along in crafting and designing what happens in terms of plans for those different regions to move away from coal to cleaner energy, to move away from mining to different other types of work. And that's really important. The other element of that, and I suppose it's closer to home, and I would really encourage people to look at, is the Just Transition Commission in Scotland, who are now on their second round of work in relation to the just transition in Scotland. And what they have done recently is to link that up with the somewhat of a well-being index and also future generations policy that the Scottish government have put in place. So really linking it together with that economic and social justice element, and not just about transforming the energy sector and other sectors to fight to ensure climate justice. So I would again encourage people to go to the Just Transition Centre of the ITUC, where you will find loads of information on the different commissions. But as I said, in Ireland at present we do not have one, but we hope to have one sooner rather than later, so that we can have that dialogue, and particularly for regions like the Midlands in Ireland, where we have the issue in terms of Bord na Móna and our peat extraction industry, where no dialogue has taken place, and where we do see already 1,000 workers have lost their jobs in the area, with no new work being introduced to the area. And it also means that communities are beginning to suffer because you do not have investment in those rural areas that were built around the peat extraction industry. So we have to get the just transition right. If we don't, what we will end up with is workers and communities having no faith in any type of climate action because they feel that they've already been left behind. So we have to get the just transition right if we are to really accelerate our action on climate for climate justice. The other area I suppose I want to just touch on here is the Right to Energy coalition that the European Public Service Union, which brings together public sector unions in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe. So, for example, the Forces Trade Union will be a member of the European Public Service Union as well as ourselves from SIPTU. But one of that element is they are part of this kind of global Right to Energy coalition, or the Right to Energy Forum, which talks about the keeping the energy sector in the hands of the public, if you want, and that is not privatized. And I think particularly is probably relevant right now in the middle of an energy crisis, that this type of work around the fight against the privatization of energy and keeping it within the public realm is really important, and also particularly in fighting against energy poverty is going to be very important. But also that role of community energy is going to be key in terms of fighting for climate justice. So again, this is another angle that unions are looking at, is how do we keep this in mind. I would say one of the other areas is probably in terms of waste collection, circular economy, is that one of the elements that we as trade unions, particularly SIPTU, is looking at is how do we bring back our waste collection within Ireland into the hands of the public, so back into local authorities and their role, rather than it being privatised. Because what we need to have is more regulation, keeping it in the hands of the public, and keeping it within local authorities, for example. So you will see quite often when we talk about climate justice, we talk about the fight against privatization and bringing things back into the hands of the public, into local authorities, and to the control of the state. The state intervention for us is very important when we're talking about climate justice. So the other element, number of elements I want to focus on, and again, it's about leaving no one behind. It's about inclusivity, and it's also about that just transition, making sure that we also fight inequality and that we don't exacerbate it. So one of the elements of climate justice is that gender lens, or looking at the element of gender equality and climate justice. And I think it's very important to touch on it, because quite often when we talk about climate, what we don't have is at an activist level. We have many women involved in looking at climate justice. We have many women organising around climate campaigning. But when we come to the decision-making table, there is very few women who are there. And we find that also when we're talking about looking at the impact of climate on women, that quite often it's not it's not part of the priority list in terms of talking about that. But it's really important when we talk about a just transition we do in looking at climate, that we look at it also from a gender lens. It's really, really important. And one of those elements, and I just want to talk a little bit about the fact, and I give a few examples. So quite often people forget to talk about why women are more impacted than men. And I think we need to talk about that openly. We need to incorporate that. And every time we talk about climate justice, is how do we look at climate justice campaigning around gender equality at the same time. So one of those elements that we like to talk about is about them, campaigners and decision makers, women being at the table when we're making decisions. And that's part of the work that we're doing in the trade union movement, is to make sure that women in every sector that we represent are part of talking about climate justice. And just to say that, as SIPTU, we're the first union that is going to set up an interdepartmental or intersector committee on climate justice, which we'll be doing in the coming months. And part of that will be ensuring that women from all sectors that we represent, from health to the public administration and community, to transport, to manufacturing, and to the services industry, that they will be at the table when we're talking about climate. The reason being, and I think if we look at various examples, is that, and I took out a few from an Oxfam report, which I think are quite shocking for people when I tell them about it. in terms of major catastrophes that have happened in the last 10-15 years, is that, for example, when there was a tsunami in Indonesia and India, that women were lost than men because they were unable to swim, or they were looking after children and trying to evacuate children first before saving themselves. Now, that's a simple example, but a very stark example of how climate change is affecting women. In America, when Hurricane Katrina hit, where it hit was in areas that were mainly working class areas, mainly single mothers, and their houses were devastated. The economy was devastated. They lost their jobs, they lost their homes, and effectively they lost also their health thereafter because of the impact of that hurricane had on the areas that they were working in. So we have to remember also that women in the global south are quite often those who have to go when their husbands or partners or the men of the tribe are away from the home, that they're the ones carrying water. They're the ones who are out doing agriculture. They're the ones cooking. They're the ones caring. They're looking after everything. So when there's a drought, for example, and they have to walk 10 more miles because now it's longer to find water in the dead of heat, all those things are beginning to affect women more than men. And one of the simple examples I give in Ireland is that we talk about, for example, moving people away from car usage to public transport. And I've had this argument recently with our own civil servants at a conference, is that the biggest ownership of cars in Ireland is women, because they have to get up in the morning, bring their children to school. They don't have the time to get the bus to work because they're short on time. They would then have to collect children from school, perhaps, or from a creche. So they need the car. They also then have to care for maybe elderly relatives or other family members. So that's why they use cars so much. But if you were to transform our economy to allow women to use public transport, it means creches need to open for longer periods of time or earlier, which means you have to then invest in the care economy, which then also means that you have to invest in public transport. Because if I'm a cleaner in a low paid job, one, I cannot afford a car. Two, if the bus is not running at 5:30 in the morning when I have to go and clean an office, I'm probably going to carpool with my friend who does have a car. So all of these elements we have to think about is how this is impacting women who do work, and the majority of who work in precarious, low-paid jobs in our country, and they're the ones who are at the risk of fuel poverty, energy poverty, economic poverty, gender inequality, and then access to simple things like public transport and others. So every time we look at this issue, you have to look at it with that gender lens of looking at how can we use climate justice to address those issues of gender inequalities that would also help us to change our economy to that zero carbon future. So that's really important. And that's why I'm highlighting here, as always, when we look at it and when we read anything on climate, we also have to look at it from that gender perspective. The other element I wanted to raise, and I think it's very important to raise, is racial justice, is climate justice. My union is one of the unions that does a lot of work around migrant workers and also refugees, asylum seekers. And the reason that I always raise racial justice is that they go hand in hand, because migrant communities are probably the most impacted in relation to climate justice. And I always have to point out to union members that refugees and asylum seekers are not those who are just fleeing conflict and persecution. We have now more than ever more refugees who are climate refugees. And I think that's very important to point out. But we also have to look at the racial injustices from the past in terms of colonialization and that impact that has, but also looking at our solidarity with the global south. Because at the end of the day, we are emitting more than they are in terms of carbon emissions, and we have to look at that. And how do we create solidarity with those who are being most affected. So it's really important, and I know there in the presentations and the other events that will happen after this one this evening, that there will be other speakers who will touch on both those issues. But I think it's important for me to say that, again, it comes back to that point at the very first slide I talked about, is that intersectionality between social justice and economic justice and climate justice, is that we always have to talk about those inequalities, and that is very important. And I think also, because we see the rise of the far right in different countries and far right politics, that really are also, I would say, against the work towards and for climate justice, that this is one of the elements that they raise quite a bit, is racism and xenophobia. So it's important for us to incorporate that into our work. The other element I want to talk about is intergenerational solidarity as part of this work. And I think it's really important that we do so. It is not just up to my generation and the older generation and the younger generation. It's about us all working together for climate action, climate justice. And just to outline some of the work that we've done, the union movement, and I know Evan mentioned that we have done work with Fridays for Future in the past, and we've also done work for the School Climate Action Network. I think it's really important that we've been doing this for a number of years now, and ourselves and the Teachers Union of Ireland, which is the TUI, have been working together to support us where we can. This work in terms of school climate strikers. And if anybody had been at COP conference in Glasgow, you would have also seen school climate strikers coming together with striking workers in Glasgow, which I thought when I was there for that protest, and to see both those type of strikers coming together was fantastic, because it shows that unions and school climate strikers can work together. And we have been doing a lot of work at the international level to encourage other unions in other countries to really come together and support and work as allies with school climate strikers. So we've allowed school climate strikers to use our offices in situ across the country. We've supported them in liaising with, obviously, in terms of their protests. And we use every opportunity we can to have them come speak to union members, and which I think is really important. And they should be part of the dialogue that we have going forward. And in fact, in my point of view, at the beginning of my trade union career, I worked at the international level of the trade union movement, and my main job was to organise, recruit, and help unions to do so, young people, and to get youth policies into trade unions. But I think this element, this climate justice and school climate strikers, have really invigorated and re-energized our union, and I think other unions' passion for this issue of climate justice. And I think it's very important that we continue to work with them. And pre-pandemic, we were out in the streets with them at all times, and we have continued to try and do so, and hope we're back to much protesting after that. I suppose the last element I really want to talk about is that climate justice is an opportunity for action. I think quite often when we talk about climate, I think it's okay for people to become anxious over the situation of our climate and our planet and the future. But I think also it's an opportunity to turn that into action. And I think every small action we can take builds up into something a little bit more. So I suppose the first thing I always ask people to do is that we have to organise for climate justice. We have to organise in our unions for climate justice. We have to organise in our communities for climate justice. And we have to organise within our own households for climate justice. And I think that's very important, that every day that we should take an action to organise around for climate action. And that's really important. The Just Transition Alliance is part of that organisation for climate justice. And this is many within Friends of the Earth would have participated in the launch of the Just Transition Alliance, which happened at the beginning of March. And one of the elements we have, and you will find it on the ICTU website, is the Just Transition Just Transition Alliance joint declaration, where we are calling for a number of issues. And I mentioned earlier on, one of those calls is for an immediate establishment of a Just Transition Commission, so that we can accelerate action around that transformation of the different sectors of our economy. And you will see in the coming weeks that we have launched an open letter to Minister Eamon Ryan around a Just Transition, our declaration. But you will see more action coming in the next number of months of us really pushing for a clear analysis of a just transition, but also looking at how do we bring our communities with us in fighting for a just transition. So I would encourage people to participate in any of the actions that we undertake. But also when you're talking to others, is that getting that commission together and getting that real just transition action going is really important. We can no longer wait to just talk about it. We have to have action on the ground, and that's about taking practical that will transform our economies, and obviously starting in the Midlands in the energy sector, and then moving on to the different sectors of our economy. Because the just transition, just to be very clear, is not just about the energy sector. It's about every sector of our economy, whether you work in a bank, whether you work in a hospital, whether you work in Bus Éireann or Dublin Bus or Irish Rail, or in the airport, or in manufacturing, in any factory in our economy. We have to talk about transforming our industries in order to meet the ambition of that we have with climate change. So that's really important that we continue to say it's every sector of our economy. So I always put this in because many people may be a union member, or they may know somebody who is a union member. But I think it's also important to say that, you know, unions are raising the consciousness of new members, campaigning and awareness. And I've listed a number of things there, and I've already talked about climate proof in the workplace, and gender, just transition, and intergenerational solidarity. But we are talking about, for example, Fashion Revolution Week, you know, that just happened in relation to global supply chains in regard to fast fashion. So I think important element. Fair trade workplaces, important because fair trade is also looking at how they can help farmers and communities in the global south to transform their practices in relation to climate, and of course zero waste movement, the war on plastic. I think all of those elements is really important, and part of that is including that, for example, in trade union publications, in our websites, and all of that. So again, it's about really incorporating the issues of climate in everything we do in the union movement. Small actions that trade unions can take. I always encourage unions to do a green audit of their own union, looking at how in terms of waste, in terms of like every other offices, it's the use of paper, the use of plastic cups, and so on and so forth. So a real green audit. Education, training material, and climate action is going to be really important for union members, because we have to empower union members to talk about climate in their workplace, whether it be at the canteen table with their colleagues, to negotiating with their employer around what we call green collective bargaining, or including climate and considerations when they're collectively bargaining for whatever issues in the workplace. Developing a green protocol for conferences. There are a number of unions, including my own, that have adopted changes for their conferences, whether that be moving from the plastic bottle of water on the table to jugs of water, to conference bags, to how do we encourage people to use public transport to get to conferences, and also now that we've experienced it during the pandemic, the use of technology to lessen the amount of travel we do in terms of meetings. This is a real work in progress, but I think a number of unions have really taken up the challenge. And then again, getting our unions to work both not only nationally, but international, European-wise, to take climate action is really. And I suppose just to say thanks for everyone listening. I always put up a few key, I suppose, points that people or phrases that people can say to everybody. And I think my most favorite one is that this is not only a local issue, it's a global issue. And it's that interconnectedness that we really have to talk about. And I think that's very important if we are to secure that faster and fairer climate action, is really remembering that this is interconnected with everything that we do. And again, it's a local issue and it's a global issue. And again, we must act now. Thank you much for listening, and thank you, Evelyn, for inviting me along this evening.
I want to say a huge thank you to Yvonne for coming this evening, and a huge thank you for that absolutely fantastic presentation, which will be available on our website. And that's it for the evening. Thank you so much to Yvonne, and thank you to everyone for joining.